My name is Nick Thomas-Symonds. I am the Member of Parliament for Torfaen and the Chair of the Aneurin Bevan Society. Welcome to the latest of my interviews with former leaders of the Labour Party on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the creation of the National Health Service. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Gordon Brown, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1997 to 2007, the Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. Welcome, Gordon. I know that, like me, you are a student of history, and we're here 70 years after the creation of the National Health Service. How do you reflect now back on its creation and indeed the philosophy behind it?
Well, sometimes there's an idea, an image, a concept that sums up a whole country, and it goes beyond historic monuments or ancient battles or personalities or even individual events. And that for Britain is the National Health Service. It's compassion in action, it's service with a human face, it's solidarity writ large, it's sympathy woven into the fabric of the whole country. And when you think of the NHS, you don't think of the hospital or the health centre or the GP surgery. You don't even think of my hospital, my GP surgery or my health centre. You think of our hospital, our health centre, our GP surgery. And that for me sums up the NHS. It's about the sharing and pooling of resources across the whole of the United Kingdom so that there is health services free at the time of need to anybody who wants it. The health service shows that we are not a marketplace, we are a community where we share for the benefit of everyone.
Now, the creator of the National Health Service, Aneurin Bevan, was a Welshman, obviously from the South Wales Valleys, but there was a strong Scottish influence on the creation of the NHS as well, wasn't there?
Well, no one should underestimate the achievement of Aneurin Bevan. He took an idea and made it happen. And within 3 years of the Labour government being formed, the National Health Service was established, and the pent-up demand for spectacles, for dental treatment, for operations was so great that the health service was almost overwhelmed within a year, showing that the need was so great and that we'd finally got away from the days in the 1930s where nurses had to leave the beds of patients to run charity flag days to pay for vital equipment, which if not found would mean massive loss of life and certainly massive discomfort for patients. So the achievement of Aneurin Bevan, and I think he talked about the idea of serenity, it made people serene in the face of illness, where before even the most courageous and strong men and women had to fear going to a doctor simply because they could not afford. They could take the pain, but they couldn't afford the money, and that was his great achievement. But the health service itself arose from people's sense that we could never repeat what had happened in the 20s and 30s. And in Scotland, I think it's interesting that Tom Johnson, who was the Scottish Secretary of State at the time, in the 1940s, in the coalition government, before the Labour government, he vetoed a proposal from Churchill and from the Treasury at the time that they would have an insurance-based health service, but people would pay for a visit to the doctor, they would pay for a visit to the hospital, so the health service under the coalition proposals would never be free. People would pay at least some money for the service and the rest would be insurance-based, and he vetoed that proposal and prevented the coalition government doing what was wrong and allowed Aneurin Bevan to come in and do what was right. So the roots of the National Health Service lay not only in Wales, where from the mining areas Aneurin Bevan could see the damage that ill health and the lack of care had done, and not just in England where they saw the chaos of what was happening during the Second World War and the need for action, but also in Scotland where the hospitals were essentially nationalised during the Second World War, and Tom Johnson was bold enough and forward-looking enough to see that the only way forward, and he told this to the face of Churchill, the only way forward was a universal health service that was free at the time of need and paid for out of general taxation.
The quotation that you mentioned in that answer about serenity in the face of illness is one that you mention in your own autobiography and the chapter on the National Health Service that appears in it. And I was struck reading it as to the level of NHS spending when you became Chancellor in 1997 as opposed to the level it was at when you left as Prime Minister in 2010, going from just under £58 billion a year to £118 billion. It's a more than doubling of spending on the NHS during your period in government, which is quite remarkable increase. How did you go about making the political case for that increase in spending on
Well,
the
the NHS required the biggest tax rise in any single budget in history, and we really planned that for 2 or 3 years in advance. We knew we had to make the argument from first principles. At that time, the Conservative Party was toying with the idea of privatisation of just about anything. We knew also we had to convince people they would get value for money. And we knew also that when people saw that it was a service in return for people paying a contribution, in other words, that it was almost hypothecated taxation, that you paid your national insurance and it then went to the National Health Service, then people were more likely to support a change and a refinancing, which, by the way, is incredibly now again necessary over these next few years. And so we worked out that we would have a commission to look at it under people who were experts, Doubt One list, that we would make the argument in principle, which I went out to do, and compared the National Health Service in Britain with what was happening in Europe and what was happening in America. We knew it had to be modern and forward-looking, so we were looking at the new treatments, the expensive new treatments, the new technologies, also genetic testing and why that made the case for an insurance-based health service, because some people might be refused treatment because they did not have the correct genetic profile in a private system. So we made a new argument, but basically it was that if you paid into your national insurance system, and employers as well as employees, then you would not only get in return a better health service, but you would get value for the money and cash that was being spent. And so that argument took 2 or 3 years to make, and we built up to it during the 2001 election campaign. We had some difficulties in getting our argument across, and then we thought how to put it across in 2002, when finally in that budget we managed to persuade people that even although it was the biggest tax rise, it was about £10 billion we raised in one budget, in one tax. It became a popular decision that people appreciated was absolutely necessary. And of course the reason was that what we inherited in 1997 was a broken down health service that was teetering from crisis to crisis. Every winter we would run out of something that would be vital, operations would be cancelled, patients would be sent home. And of course we were not spending the money on the new buildings that were necessary, and many of them were still Victorian buildings in 2000 when we were looking at this. And there was the most massive hospitaling program that was agreed on that took us through to 2010. Every generation has to look at how it finances the health service. So we had to do this for the generation from 1997 to 2010. But of course, you've got to look at it again now. And the refinancing of the health service is absolutely essential now, particularly to cope with social care, but also to cope with rising problems like mental illness. And I would say the health service now is 20 billion a year short, or will be in the next few years, of the resources it needs. We're losing doctors and nurses because of what's happening with Brexit, and at the same time the Conservative government have not accepted that the case has got to be made to the public for the refinancing of the health service, which I believe, if properly put, people would be prepared to accept.
A bit more controversial in the 97 to 2010 period were things like, the foundation hospitals and PFI. I mean, how do you reflect now on those things in terms of lessons to learn and the structure of the NHS going forward?
Well, the essential fact of the health service is it is a public service. It's not a private service. We are not dealing with a marketplace. This is a community and a network of experts, of helpers, of carers, not just doctors and surgeons, but also nurses, midwives, and people assisting right across the board, from the porter to the cleaner to the catering staff. And therefore, we're dealing with a community. And I believe that when you ask people, both inside and outside the National Health Service, what makes them most proud of Britain, it's the National Health Service. And it's unique because it does not rely on people having to pay for the service. Now, if you want to use people who have got a particular expertise, or companies that have got some new technology or some delivery sort of mechanism, vehicle that is useful to the health service, I see nothing wrong with that. But the fundamental principle must never be breached, that the NHS is free at the point of need. And anything that we do must be to serve the public interest and not the interest of a few profiteers or a few privatisers or a few private companies. And I think the general public, left, right, centre, I think agrees with that principle. And I don't think that they will allow any government to breach that principle for long without throwing them out.
When you were Prime Minister, you used an interesting phrase about the National Health Service being developed to become a service that was personal to you. And it was something, over your 3 years in that office that obviously sought to achieve. Do you think going forward that really personalised care is what the future of the NHS should actually be?
Yeah, I think it's got to be a service that is provided to everyone, but it's also got to be personal to everyone. I really think in the modern world, and you look right round the globe, every continent, where people are pressing for the standard and quality of services which are delivered by the public sector to be far more individualised, to be far more tailored to people's needs, to be far more in tune with what people's expectations and their desires are, their comfort, their timetables, what suits them in terms of the hours that they're available for a particular treatment and where they need to go. I don't think you can just talk about a standard service. You've got to talk about a service that is personalised to the very individual who's in need of care. And after all, we're often dealing with people who are in the greatest need, with maximum vulnerability, people who are worried about their future. They need the time, they need the attention, they need the sense that they are being cared for as an individual and not just being ticked off as a box that has got to be filled for a particular service that is given. So the more the health service develops, the more it's got to be a personal service. The more it's got to be individualised and tailored to people's needs. And I see that as something that is really possible within the system that we've got. We have already the compassion and care of the people who serve the National Health Service as full-time employees. We have already an understanding from the patients that they are treated and should be treated as individuals. And I think we can make the NHS more, particularly, of course, for social care, where as people get older, it's the attention that they get, not always the medical care, but the personal attention that they get, the social care that really does matter. So our aim for the health service moving forward is, yes, we've got this massive technology that can treat illnesses and hopefully can cure diseases like cancer that have been long the worry and anxiety that people have if they're ever to suffer from them. But equally at the same time, as people live longer, they will need that personal attention. And the NHS has got to put itself in that position where it's national, yes, but it's also local and individual and personal.
There was a great contrast, I think, between that argument, and if you think across the United States and Obamacare and the debate that was going on at the same time, is there a real contrast between how we see healthcare, perhaps now as a result of Bevan's achievement as a right in this country, but perhaps it remains something of a luxury, a product in the United States? Do you think that's a fair contrast?
Yes, we looked at America before we made our major tax changes, and we showed that, in fact, even with the Obama reforms, it's pretty true that America is still about money. It is still about being able to jump the queue. It is still about getting a health service based on your ability to pay rather than on the need that you have. And while there are more people insured, money still talks. And we saw this at first hand when my son was ill when he was in the United States of America and had to be in hospital for 2 days. And of course we had to pay quite a substantial amount, covered in the end by insurance, but it was a substantial amount. Whereas in the National Health Service, he could have walked into the hospital, nobody would have asked about his finances, and he would have got excellent care nonetheless. So there's still a huge difference between an NHS which is based on need and not ability to pay, and an American system that still seems very tied to the idea that it's what you pay that actually counts.
Going forward, what do you think the biggest challenge is that the NHS faces?
I think the insurance principle has got to be defended, and the NHS as an institution free at the point of need has got to be shown to be effective. And I think if you look at some of the modern challenges we face, like genetic testing, so if an insurance company can test at birth someone, as they will be able to do, and say that this patient or potential patient is more vulnerable to a set of conditions, a set of diseases, a set of costly treatments, then they would be at liberty in many countries simply to refuse that patient. But if we pool and share the costs of everybody's treatment, no matter how ill or potentially in need of healthcare they are, then we can satisfy both the demand of the individual and do it within the costs that are allocated by the nation. If it's one person who's having to go and be assessed for their viability as a patient, then then it's an expensive business. If it's the whole nation and the costs are pooled, then that is possible. So I think every argument that I see, genetic testing, the pressure of social care, the rising costs of treating mental as well as physical illness, the desire for a preventative service as well as a desire for a curative service, all these new demands on the health service that perhaps were not appreciated in 1948, they all actually make the case for an insurance-based health service free at the point of need, where you pay through general taxation and in this case national insurance, but don't have to pay at the time of treatment.
Finally, Gordon Brown, do you think there'll still be a National Health Service 70 years from now?
If there wasn't a National Health Service, then we would not be the Britain that we are. If there wasn't a National Health Service, then we would have fallen for a marketplace ideology where we put private gain above social gain. If there wasn't a health service, I think we would be in danger of abandoning the principles that unite this country together. And of course we are 4 nations, but we are bound together by our support for tolerance and liberty, but also by our sense of social responsibility and our desire for fairness. And there is no better example of that desire for fair play or for fair treatment than the National Health Service itself. The National Health Service is the living embodiment of a country that works together and is prepared to share for the common good. And when someone is really in need, and this is what happens every day in the National Health Service, then they go to the top of the queue because their need is what defines what delivers the treatment, not their ability to pay.
Gordon Brown, thank you very much.